facilitated by these amazing authors. I'm excited to share too that they have received this year's JEE Lickett Award for a paper related to this work that they'll be presenting with us today. And I'll introduce one of our facilitators, and he will go ahead and introduce the rest. So Dr. Stephen Seekules, welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm going to let you take over the screen share.
All right, thank you so much. Can we all see my screen and hear me okay? Great, thank you. So yeah, thanks so much, Ali, for that introduction. I'll be kicking off in just a second, introducing all my co-authors, Cassandra, Alex, Matilda, Martina. You'll hear from more of us in a second, but we have some additional, sorry, I should have had these copied. We have 2 additional questions for you, like as we had our own kind of starter polls. So they'll pop up. They're anonymous. They're just going to make a word cloud of all of our kind of identities. The first question: which identities are most salient? Up to 3 most salient to your research or practice work. So kind of by salient, I just which ones kind of organize a lot of your thinking, which ones come up for you a lot. And then the second question, which identities get left out of your work, which ones kind of, maybe, perhaps that identity is there, but it doesn't come to the forefront as often. It's not kind of on your mind, front of mind as often. And by identities, we're thinking mostly demographic identities, race, gender, ability, disability, socioeconomic class, educational background, but you can take that. It's anonymous. You can take that identity question wherever you feel comfortable. So I'll give you a minute to do both of those, and then I'll be pulling up our word cloud. Okay. Probably have to keep refreshing these. It seems like it's not live. All right. I'll give you like 30 more seconds, and then but yeah, keep putting them in, and we can keep seeing this. Okay. So among us, a lot of people find gender and gender as woman. That's coming up for people a lot. Race is also coming up a lot. And clearly there's a wide mix of identities that are salient to us respectively. And yeah, so we'll contrast this with the list of identities that don't come up as often in our work. But I'm sure we're going to see some overlap. Some of the things that are front and center from some people are going to be not front and center for others. So just refreshing this to make sure I get all of your, oh, it seems slow, but okay. Okay, here we go. So yeah, some overlap for other people. Gender is not front and center. Being heterosexual, not front and center in and front and center identity in their work. Being Latina, being a mother, straight, able-bodied. Able-bodied looks like it's in a pretty big print. I think that makes sense. That might be one that a lot of people aren't maybe hold and aren't thinking about. And yeah, then quite a lot of others. Okay, great. thanks for starting that out with us. We wanted to start out with a way of connecting this topic to all of us kind of right from the get-go, and we're going to keep kind of going deeper as we go. We'll have some more time for reflection in breakout rooms. So with that, I'll just let you know that our plan for the talk is introductions. We're going to talk about positionality, what it is, why does it matter. We're going to have some breakout rooms for small group reflections. We're going to discuss the positionality framework from that paper that Ali mentioned. We'll have each co-author kind of take a different dimension and talk through it, so you'll get to hear from all of us. And then we'll have time for Q&A, open discussion. Oh, by the way, we have multiple, I am probably going to be busy and talking a bit, especially at the beginning here. So I might not see your comments, but please use the chat for comments throughout this. We have multiple, 4 of my co-authors are here, and then we have other CDEI support. So we have multiple people who can see a comment and either raise it to the speaker or kind of respond, clarify to you. So if you have questions, please feel free to make it interactive, especially through the Zoom. Maybe towards the end of the talk, we can also, in the breakout rooms and towards the end of the talk, maybe we can also do some unmuting and talking more. All right, these are the facilitator co-authors. Facilitators, you're all here. I was just going to have us each go around and maybe quickly do our names and answer those top questions, which of our identities come up and which ones are backgrounded in our work. So I'll go first. My name is Stephen Seekels, and I'm assistant professor at Florida International University in Engineering and Computing Education. And I am, it's not a secret, it happened, it's identified in the positionality statement. I'm a gay white man, and that those identities come front and center, and I think about race and gender pretty often, but I guess they are front and center in my mind, but being LGBTQ is really not front and center in most of my work. I don't really study LGBTQ participant populations. So it's kind of like it's kind of one of those background, but still front and center. It depends on context, like how front and center that identity is, in different professional contexts or personal contexts. So that's mine. I'll just call on you in order. Cassandra.
Everyone, I'm Cassandra McCall. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Engineering Education at Utah State. And so for me, the identities that are front and center for me are particularly, my gender, being a woman, a cis woman in engineering. A lot of my background experiences as an engineering undergraduate student, for a lot of you here, has really informed a lot of the work that I do and how I think about my research. The other aspect is disability, my disability identity. So that is one that I'm still working through, even with myself, in terms of when I was diagnosed with my specific condition, I guess you could say that way, from a medicalized perspective. So thinking about what does disability mean to me, and how is that reflected in engineering? And I look at that a lot with my participants. In terms of what's not highlighted in my work or salient for me, race is typically one. So I feel like the privileges that I have as a white woman, those are things that I'll think about when I see conflicts with that. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean with that. And also my background growing up in a rural community. And so being from this very rural area, moving to these more urban places through grad school and through my work. And yeah, I'll talk more about those later on. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Matilda.
Okay, hello, my name is Matilda Sanchez Pena, an assistant professor of engineering education at the University at Buffalo here in the State University of New York. In my research, I think the four front and center identities that lead a lot of my work are based on my gender identity, as a cisgender women, and like as well with time things have changed, right? So now like my ethnicity takes more of a first light, and the other layer that always comes with my research in terms of the equity and inclusion challenges, now that I'm in the U.S. context, is my immigrant status and how that like aligns with understanding the experiences of people that grow up here. So, and the things that are not necessarily that salient for sure is my socioeconomic class that I was grown up at, and that I'm able-bodied. So, Martina.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Martina Swantek, and I am the Assistive Technology Specialist at the University of Virginia. In terms of what is really salient in my work right now, I would say disability, and something that has switched has been like my status within academia, switching from being a graduate student to being a university staff person. And that's been a drastic shift in how faculty interact with me, which has been really interesting. As I just got my PhD last year, and suddenly, because of where my office is located in student affairs, I'm not taken as a serious person in the university anymore. Something that's been less salient for me throughout my life and throughout all of these changes is being a heterosexual married person in graduate school. That's never really come up in conversation. Or as part of my research practice. And I will hand it off to Alex, who is our last co-presenter facilitator for the day.
Thank you, Martina. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you for making some time to come to the workshop. I'm Alex Mejia. I would say that for me, and for the work that I do, my most salient social identity is that I identify myself as Latino, primarily as Mexican American, right? Because there's a lot of different types of Latinos. We're not a monolithic group, and I think that that is also what has guided a lot of my research. I think that along with that, some other things come in hand with that. The fact that I came from another country, even though I was born in this country, right? Like living in that transnationalism sphere, which it's not the case for a lot of people. I would say that one of the identities that have not necessarily come into conversation a lot is my connections to my family, and how I am in fact very privileged compared to a lot of my own family members who may have a different legal status than mine here in the United States, but that still influences how I see the world and the participants that I work with.
All right, thanks everybody. So yeah, those are your co-facilitators for today. Next, I'll talk a bit about what positionality is. My personal kind of go-to sort of way of thinking about it is, there might be other frames of thinking about research that emphasize kind of quality, rigor, methods. There might be things that kind of de-emphasize the nature of like, well, this is actually a person who's doing some sort of thing as a person, and in a community, which is all people. So to me, my shorthand for positionality is kind of all the considerations of a researcher as a person. So to me, this wraps in the researcher perspective. Researcher as instrument is the idea of, like, particularly in some qualitative research, knowing that like you asking questions as an interviewer, as a like observing a setting as an observer, like you are the research tool, research instrument in those moments. And so you bring your whole self to those moments. And we can talk more about that. Reflexivity, a big word, just kind of meaning a reflective awareness of how we are kind of doing our research and thinking about the kind of connotations and implications of it while engaging in it. Awareness of our demographic identities, like we kind of started out in the introduction. Awareness of bias, potential bias, if you are kind of framing the work that way, or perhaps it's kind of more framed as a perspective, less of a bias. And our relationship to participant community, I think Alex was just hinting at that. At all times, we're also engaging, as people with research participants in our respective fields, either as qualitative researchers, where we can be extremely interactive with the participants, and kind of all other researchers in social sciences there are also people on the other end of these research topics. So that's just some of the topics. There's more, but yeah, I have this photo because I like thinking about it as kind of like it's a reflective moment for like you as you relate to the world. It's kind of not just you and navel gazing and like you like staring into the window, but it's like you into the mirror, but it's like you and your relationship to this like broader world. So that's my take. If you have other things you want to expand the definitions, feel free to put them in the chat. But that's my like starter summary. And why is positionality important to equity and education research, or like kind of all of diversity, equity, inclusion, since we're at CDEI today, and education research, particularly engineering education research, kind of why is it important to all of those? Well, as I was just hinting, my first basic answer about that is like all of those education, equity issues are all like deeply personal, social, interpersonal activities. So you can't do education without involving people who have demographic identities, people who have a race, have a gender. Like all of these are factoring into just everyday educational life all the time. You also can't do research without people. So they're like, I have this photo of this person taking notes in a classroom. You can have guesses about this person's, race and gender. We don't have to, try to do that in a picture at the moment, but you can imagine how that lens, is informing this person's research at this moment. Like we can see, like in another picture, we can see like people just engaging in a type of classroom setting, thinking about which demographics sort of influence a classroom setting, and which ones are we familiar with, which do we feel comfortable with, which ones are we unfamiliar with and would be off-put by, which participant communities are we familiar with and engage in, which do we take as normal, taken for granted, this is how these settings should be, and which ones do we problematize or notice. So educational settings are just fundamentally people, involve people, and people carry with them these many identities that are coming to the forefront or staying in the background, but these are all kind of intermixing in engineering education at all times. And then I put a stock photo. This is not actually ASCE, but I put a stock photo off the internet of a academic conference just to think about. Also, researchers are people who they bring their own, perspectives, demographics. They are people who engage in the activity of research and come and talk about research, and they have a whole community and perspective. And we can kind of think about, who is the average ASCE attendee in terms of demographics, like what are our norms, who is that person's perspective, and who is the average, and what are all the diversities of perspectives that are in there, not just the norms, but the multitudes. And how does that relate to the context that we study? Is is our professional community a wider community than, you know, the kind of average public school in the country? How do we relate to like international contexts? How, you know, how many of our community reflect, you know, perspectives from the disability community, et cetera? Like, how do we, who are we? And coming to that awareness, like coming to that awareness of who we are and what perspectives we bring, help us do, help us be more aware, you know, present our work more transparently, and you know, it's important to kind of tie our own self-awareness with our awareness of our participants and surrounding communities, in order to be aware and clear and strategic about those contrasts. Okay, so that's why positionality can be important to equity and education research. Co-authors, if I just interrupt me if there's anything important I'm leaving out, we can always backtrack to a slide. But this is from our paper, that paper that Ellie mentioned and introduced. We'll say more about it later, but for now, just Cassandra could talk about the way positionality has been discussed in engineering education research.
Yeah, and so thanks, Stephen. And before I do that, I did want to address a question that arose at some point since we started the workshop, and that was regarding what do we mean when we talk about a salient identity. So for those of us who do research in identity and think about this a lot, the term salient kind of becomes second nature, to where we just kind of say it and expect everyone to know what we're talking about. So we really appreciate that question in terms of, you know, figuring out what exactly is salience, what is identity saliency, or what is a salient identity. And one of the ways that we've used in the past to kind of describe it to people who might not be as aware of it, and co-authors, please feel free to jump in as you see fit, but thinking about, at least when I talk to students about it, it's thinking about those identities that you're aware of in your day-to-day interactions, what comes out to the forefront of who you are in a given context. So an example is, and I talked a little bit about my gender, is my first engineering class ever, there was 30 of us and there were only 2 women in the class. And so in that moment, I was very aware of my gender identity because I was one of 2 women in this class. And so thinking about that, then having that in the back of my mind, you know, when I would go to the class, engage in group activities, it was just something that was kind of always there. And so really bringing forward that awareness. Now, as someone who's white, since our culture is normatively white, it doesn't come up for me. So I have that privilege there that other people do not in terms of my social interaction. So for me, I'm not very aware of my race, but in certain contexts, I'm very aware of my gender identity. And this could be both positive and negative. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're having a negative, you know, you're negatively experiencing a salient identity if it is salient for you. So it can take many forms. And so just really quickly, I wanted to make sure that see if any of the other co-authors had anything to add about that.
I was going to add, I think you made a good point. Hi, everybody. My name is
Chanel.
Hi, nice to meet you. I think the point you made about it not necessarily being good or bad is important, because often when people hear about positionality, they're used to hearing about it in a punitive context in terms of like, you're not in the right positionality to do this research. But I think a lot of the point of what we're doing is not just, you know, positive or negative related to identity, but more so like being aware of it and speaking to the way that nuance shows up. And I think specifically as it relates to contextualizing our methodologies, a lot of times when we don't have a identity that's in conflict, we just assume we don't have to contextualize our positionality with the methodology. Mm-hmm. But usually that's the time where it's the most important, because there's something implicit, something silent that makes you just assume that this methodology therefore makes sense. And that's for me as a, Black woman with a bunch of targeted identities, I'm always pressing on methodology because for me, that's what really, that's what people experience, that's what matters. But for my coworkers and my colleagues, it's helpful when they're pressing on methodologies as well, even when their identities are not in tension, because usually that's where the rubber meets the road. That's usually where a lot of the important transformation can happen. So thank you so much for pointing that out, Cass.
Yeah, thanks, Chanel. And as a note, Chanel's also a co-author on this paper, and she also did the really awesome artwork that is on the front page of the slide, or on the first slide, and also appeared on the cover of JEE on the issue that this paper is in. So yeah, that was by Chanel. So she did great on that. So in terms of looking at positionality, kind of our first question was, what's actually going on with positionality in engineering education? And if you've read this paper, if you have yet to read this paper, the portion of where we're looking at different types of positionality in research is pretty cursory. It's pretty small. We didn't want it to be the focus of the paper. However, you could write an entire paper just on analyzing all of these different types of publications and what type of positionality is presented in there. And so in this figure, so there's this bar chart on the right side of the slide where we have three major categories of the types of positionality. So we have a gray bar for publications from ASEE, so just the American Society for Engineering Education proceedings and papers that have been published through their associated conferences such as Connected. And then for the black bars, then we have articles listed from the Journal of Engineering Education. And so from this analysis that we did, it was just kind of a large scale thematic analysis where we identified three categories. The first is acknowledging practice. So this is kind of more based along what Stephen was talking about in terms of reflexivity, and Chanel also started talking about it too. They're pretty intermixed, it seems like, in terms of, you reflecting on the procedures that you're doing. A lot of times in this first category though, what we saw was that these were mostly like quality type checks in terms of, needing to discuss a code book or things like that. Then there was category 2, which is establishing transparency of self-attributes. So then this is where the researchers tend to shift more from the procedural to more of the personal. And then at the other end, we also have that category 3, which is contextualizing methodology, where the researcher is contextualizing aspects of their research in their identity. And so the difference between category 2 and category 3 is category 2 is more where you're just kind of identifying these different characteristics of yourself. And then category 3 kind of moves beyond that and then really starts to link the methodological decisions from a researcher to their different identities and their worldviews within that research. And so in terms of what we found from this brief literature review, we found the most articles that acknowledge practice, that talk about positionality more as a quality type check in terms of methods. And so there were 19 articles there in ASEE, 15 in JEE. Then our second most category was establishing transparency. So disclosing some of those identities, particularly in written work, right? Where we just see each other's written words. So we have 10 from ASEE, 6 from JEE, and then this contextualizing methodology. And if you look at the paper, Alex's work fits in this really well. He does a great job at this. He was kind of, Alex's work was kind of one of the pieces that really stuck out when we were first examining this literature, because he really connects his research with who he is, how he views the world. We found 7 of those in ASEE and only 2 in JEE. So that's just a very broad overview of that lit review.
Thanks. All right. So just to summarize, to recap, we saw some positionality statements that were like category 1, kind of very broad and philosophical and didn't discuss a lot of the personal. And then category 2 was kind of like thinking only about the like demographic, but kind of not making a lot of connections to the actual process of the research. And then category 3 was making a connection between the two. So this is a preview of the positionality framework. We'll talk more about it in the second half, but I wanted to kind of make a connection between, essentially, we saw like kind of a start with examining dimensions of our own identities. So like all of the kind of intersections of demographic identity and how they kind of contribute to our perspective and experience. And then we saw kind of like a reciprocal reflective arrangement relationship with these dimensions of positionality. And these are more how they intersect our research in research topic, epistemology, ontology, methodology, researcher's instrument, and communication. So we're getting more in depth into that later, but I wanted to preview that we're now going to kind of do a reflective breakout room activity with you around examining dimensions of our identity. And Alex is going to introduce that to us.
Sorry. Yes. Well, thank you, Stephen. So
I got to do the quick get that Google Drive thing. 1 second. Okay, it's back. Go ahead.
The link. Okay. All right. So you're gonna see a link on the chat box. It's a PDF file. I did this purposefully because I think that also reflecting on your own positionality is a very personal thing. Primarily if you're doing it for the first time, right? And you get to reflect on your own positionality. So let me go through the guidelines, and then I'll ask you to go into the Google Drive. So the document itself, it's a PDF. You can download it, I think, and just work on it, or maybe like on a piece of paper, start writing some things in there. I know that we have limited amount of time, so you might not have all of the time to do like a huge reflection, but it's a tool that is very, very useful. Stephen, if you want to show the image, please. Yes, thank you. So on this document, what you're gonna see, you're going to see an inner circle, okay? Those inner circle represent the different social identities that Stephen was talking about in the previous slide. I just had here 8 different social identities. It doesn't mean that those are the only ones that exist. They can be expanded, but we try to put it in a single document, and that's how they could fit all in one document. So in this case, this include, I believe, it can include gender, age, citizenship, ability, race, ethnicity, you name it, okay? So there on those boxes, you're gonna write for that particular axis, what type of social identity you identify with, right? Or which one is the most salient. For example, as I mentioned before, for me, if I were to talk about ethnicity, being Latino is probably for me the most salient. If I was to talk about ability, I would say probably able-bodied, right? So that's where you're going to identify which each one of the different categories in there. Then what you're going to do, you can see that there's boxes surrounding the inner circle, right? Or the inner boxes. Each one of those has just 2 boxes. Again, it is just a simplification. It doesn't mean that there's only 2 different things that that you can use, right? But for simplification, that's what we did. And in those boxes, what you're gonna do, you're gonna write or you're gonna name the 2 ways in which this particular identity that you have identified for yourself affects your day-to-day life, and just using a simple word, okay? So for example, healthcare can be an impact, right, whether positive or negative, associated with the social identity of upper middle class, particularly here in the United States where we don't have universalized healthcare, right? So this impacts may be experienced as positive, negative, a mixture. It's up to you, okay? Again, this is for your own personal reflection. And then on the outside, you're gonna see little lines. I couldn't add more boxes because then it would be too crowded. So I just added like little line spaces where you will use these outer lines to write the emotions that you might experience as a result of the pragmatic impacts of those different things that you had identified on the smaller boxes on the second circle, okay? So for example, privilege and desire to help can be two emotions that are experienced with or in connection with white racial identity, for example, okay? So it is up to you. It's on your own way to reflect on these different circles. I think we're gonna give you about 10 minutes. Again, 10 minutes is not enough to complete something like this, right? This is something that also evolves over time, that you might need more time for that. And I think, oh, and by the way, on the document, it comes to reference where this actually comes from. It's a really good tool. You can use it for your own research with your own students in grad school. And I don't know if Stephen, are we going to break them into separate groups?
Yeah, we're gonna do breakout rooms. I would say we can probably try to reconvene at 3, just 10 minutes for reflection, 10 minutes for discussion, and you'll have a co-facilitator in your room. So co-facilitators manage that as you can. And yeah, Megan Pollock put a different version of this in the chat, so you could use this. I don't know it, but we could do that as the fillable. She has a fillable version, but we have our low-tech version. So pick one of those, or you could do it by hand, or just like a reflective writing.
What happened?
It seems like Stephen got
I don't hear
disconnected.
anything
Cut
either.
off.
Yeah.
I think, are we still ready to go in breakout rooms?
Yes, I opened up the breakout rooms.
I thought maybe I needed to come back to the breakout room to finish talking. I was put in a breakout room, but I'm assuming they're all opening, and then you'll all go to them, and then I'll call you back at 3.
Perfect.
I thought we had more
It's all right, Cass. I'm sorry.
Oh no, that's okay. I thought we still had like 11 minutes, and yeah.
It's all good.
The room that got the visually impaired person did not see the units on the time and thought we had minutes instead of seconds left.
I'm sorry. I apologize for that.
I could put y'all back in the breakout room. It looks like the breakout room was still set from like a previous meeting, so I can put y'all back in if y'all want. It's
We can
not
do
a
like
big
5 more minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
Will it be the same
All right.
rooms?
Yes, it will be. And I'm sorry about that.
Awesome. Thanks, Bree.
Okay, now we were kicked out for good. So
Yeah.
all right, everyone. So I guess this, like I said initially, this activity was primarily for you, for your own self-reflection and thinking about your own positionality, and then eventually coming up with a way to really describe a good positionality statement that brings your whole self into the research, right? Which is, I mean, you always bring your whole self into the research, right? But now communicating it in an effective way is also important. I wanted to take a few minutes, if possible. Do we have some time for that? Yeah,
I
for
mean, we only have
debriefing.
half an hour left. Do you want to do the framework, Phil? What are your idea? What's your idea?
I was just gonna ask, like, take 5 minutes to debrief the activity itself. I think that you may have had different levels of confidence filling out certain tiers in the circles, right? When I've done this with students, usually the inner circle is the most difficult to do, particularly if this is the first time that you're trying to do it. Why? Because we don't think about these things often, right? Like we don't take the time to really think about the broader aspects of our identities in the world, right? So a lot of the times you might experience some tensions or even some clashes in how you're thinking about your identity, but most importantly about the emotions that these identities really create on you. I also want to mention here that a lot of the times the emotions are not just negative, they can be also positive, right? But even those emotions and how you see the world is important to understand. Paulo Freire talks about, in terms of critical literacies, he talks about how it is important to be able to read the words, right? But it's also important to read the world around you, right? So how critically are you reading the words that that you have in front of you, but also how critically you read the world that surrounds you. And I think that, for example, even if I am Latino and I work, most of my participants are Latinos, right? But if I don't consider this other aspect of my identity, which is that I do have citizenship, right? Working with DACA students, it's going to be a completely different dimension, right? It's going to result in maybe even some type of different interpretation, how I'm interpreting what they're saying and the types of things that I'm trying to communicate to them. They may not, I was telling my the group when we were debriefing very quickly that a lot of the times, if I'm working with an undocumented student, I do not have a whole grasp of who they are because I've never had the issue of, getting a bank account, getting a social security card, right? Those kind of things that a lot of the times we take for granted. Even though I identify as Latino with that other individual, I do not get a full grasp of the whole situation. And we're going to talk about this later on, but that is one of the reasons why building that trust, that dyadic, interaction with that person is so important, right? You cannot just do research going as an outsider, right? A lot of people in research call it voyeuristic activity, right? But you actually have to get immersed. You have to really get invited by that community and start to build that trust that you need. So that's all I wanted to mention.
All right. So we've done the small group reflection. Next, we're going to walk through the positionality framework, and then hopefully we'll still have some time for Q&A. So yes, in that paper that's been referenced a lot, we kind of all of these 7 co-authors, including Chanel and Adam, we kind of reflected together about the way those identity dimensions impacted our research, and we tried to reflect on them and kind of come up with some big areas, dimensions of positionality impact. The as I referenced before, it kind of involves this intersection between those reflections on identity that you were just doing and these dimensions of positionality. So we essentially, our research process was to reflect around these questions. How does your positionality impact what research you choose to do? How does your positionality impact how you know what you know? How does your positionality impact what you observe as a researcher? How does your positionality impact how you make methodological choices? How does your positionality impact how you relate to participants? And how does your positionality impact how you represent yourself in writing and other communication? These are probably not completely exhaustive of all aspects of positionality, so you can feel free to expand on our work. But these are the ones that came up as like central for us. So I'm going to now walk through each. We're going to each walk through one, and this will just be an intro to that topic, to that reflection topic. We invite you to continue reflecting on these, doing your own positionality reflections beyond this, and you'll just hear like one example from each of us. So the first, how does positionality impact what research you choose to do? So I'm gonna just take this one as first author and also represent kind of all of us. So you've heard from, I didn't put Chanel's and Adam's on. I didn't know Chanel would be in the room today, but essentially I took an example, paper title from each one of us, because I think one of the things we noticed when reflecting on this one, how does it impact what research you choose to do, was that it really, everybody had an experience of their positionality, their identities impacting what research they chose to do, but it was in sometimes kind of surprising or like not completely linear ways. So for a lot of people, for a lot of us, I think like an experience and a central identity, sometimes a marginalized identity, like Martina and Cassandra's experience around with disability, those become central, like they're central motivators in their research, and kind of similar with Alex and being Latinx. These kind of, it was easy for me to find an example of like that being highlighted and central in their work. And sometimes these are we'd call them the emic, the insider perspective, like by being from that community, these are the like they have individual personal knowledge of the community, and that kind of motivates their engagement in the research topic. And I do the same. So I have this paper like problematizing engineering educational culture in terms of masculinity. But I think as a white man, I am often inclined to center marginalized groups regarding race and gender, and not only the groups that I have privilege, or not only the groups that I have identity dimensions within. I have other papers, but usually if I'm writing, I try to kind of write in a critical of kind of the dominant groups, critical of groups that I am kind of a member of. That's oftentimes how I relate to racial and gender privilege. Or if I feel like I'm writing about marginalized groups, non-dominant groups, then I am often co-authoring with a person who's a member of that group. That's just, I'm not saying that's a rule of thumb that everybody has to follow, but it's a thing that I have found myself doing, because I have personally, kind of similar to Alex was saying, you have to watch kind of not having a sort of voyeuristic outsider stance towards topics. That is one I've really enjoyed collaborating with authors who are from other communities, so that I can kind of see inside them with that insider perspective. So these are some of the some of the ways that our positionality impacts the research we choose to do. I'll pass it on. Oh, I could just pause for a second. Does any other co-author did I miss anything about this topic? Okay. Cassandra?
All right, so In terms of epistemology then, so how does your positionality impact how you know what you know? And one of the things that was really salient for me, and Stephen, you can put, yeah, both of those up there, was kind of, I mentioned earlier that I'm from a very rural area in southwestern South Dakota, very white, tiny town, everybody knows everybody. And the mentality there is very much like, if you work hard, you work hard and you earn what you work for, and people can pull themselves up by here by the bootstraps or whatever. And I genuinely thought that that's how the world worked growing up. That was what I knew. I was not I did not have really any experience with diverse groups of people. The systems we have in place, it's like, oh, that's the way it is, and that's just how it works, and the outcomes are the outcomes. And then as I went to grad school, and as I left South Dakota later on, it became apparent to me that no, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. And that different people experience the systems that we use to structure our society, our policies, and everything. There's different realities that they're experiencing because of that. And so, and really for me, things that the last presidential administration was really kind of an eye-opener also for me with this, even more so than before, because you start getting into those philosophical type conversations of what is fact, what is fake news, what is, even to the point of what is history, what is the past, and then also even like highlighting through all of these demonstrations, the experiences of our Black and Brown brothers and sisters, and how they experience all of these oppressive systems. And this also goes into other identity aspects, right? Disability, gender, and we're seeing more movements. Now, for me, experiencing those conflicts. So before we've talked a little bit about, these conflicts, I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way, but something that's different than what I know or that I think I know. And so I then kind of dive into those experiences and try to learn from those different experiences from others to then make sense of what I know. How do I know what I know? And in the paper, we talk a little bit about how each of us kind of have our own process for doing that, in terms of how we take in information, how we're processing information, and essentially using that information in our research.
Great. I'll do this really fast. It's thinking about how does your positionality impact what you observe as a researcher. I'll just say that in my experience as an ethnographer, a lot of this is from a research setting that I was the ethnographic researcher in. And my own prior experience being an engineering student, being a white man who was an engineering student, all of that kind of affects what kind of things I think are normative and expected and I'm familiar with, and that's how an engineering classroom should act. And as ethnographers talk, we make the familiar strange, we problematize those types of norms. So all of that is to say that our identities can shape what we think, what we take for granted, what we expect to find in any setting, and what we have to kind of work to become aware of, based on that positionality. So that's all I'll say to leave plenty of time to the other co-authors' topics.
So in terms of methodology and methodological choices, my own position is really centered on the how do we do our research and what choices do we make in order to do research. So for my dissertation work, I spent a lot of time figuring out how would someone who uses a screen reader approach this same topic. I'm not a screen reader user, but I'm interested in disability and accessibility. And there are signs like this. The image on screen right now is a photo from Purdue University, and it's stating that the building is non-accessible, and that's a college campus in 2022. So like this just permeates through all of the work and all of the choices I do in terms of how do I choose to do my research.
All right, great.
All right. So on the topic of research as instrument, I think that this is where we think about how this positionality impacts how you relate to your research participants and how you bring not just your body, but your whole self into the study that you're conducting. For me, I think that it is always important to think about what is the type of mutual reciprocity that exists between me and my participants, right? Am I the only one who's benefiting from this, or is there something also for my participants? And if there's something in there for my participants, am I being a true voice to what they're telling me? Am I being that person that is letting them speak up rather than taking up space for them, right? So I really believe in that researcher as an instrument is also about developing that trust, right? Confianza, that's the term that I like to use, because that's what shows that form of mutual reciprocity. And that presence is super important, right? That it indicates that both parties are always recognizing each other and honoring their relationship, their emotions, their experiences, right? And I think that has a huge impact on not just how you conduct your research, but also how you interpret the type of research that you're engaging in.
All right, thanks. And then, oh, just another image, sorry. Matilda.
Yeah, so the last dimension, which is communication, basically making ourselves truthful to the way that we communicate. So here's a list of my visible and hidden identities. And for sure, how do we represent ourselves when showcasing our work that we really care about, of course, because all these dimensions are already like getting parts of ourselves there, right? I do have an example, which I think it's worth sharing. Like in one of the first papers that I wrote, dealing about the issues of mental health in engineering education, right? We were really impacted by the way that Margaret Price handled the topic in medical school, and there was a lot of rhetorics and how you challenged how the language is being used, right? So we started this abstract with crazy, psycho, insane as the opening words, kind of like trying to make it a challenging thing or a conversational thing in terms of like, well, this is not acceptable kind of thing. But the reader itself felt triggered, and of course, it was a person that had conditions of mental health. So interesting to us, right? Which all the co-authors were also had experience with mental health conditions. That was definitely not the intention, right? But if we would have had this layer of saying, this is our intention because this is the way we identify ourselves, the narrative would have been so different, right? So that intentionality in terms of like, okay, what do I really need to make transparent in order for this message to get through the way that I really intention it to be, right? That is part of it, right? Like, and I think this is part of, well, what the threshold always lies in people. It's like, well, do I really need to open up about all my identities? Well, which are those identities that are relevant for the things that you're talking about and that they can make more harm than good from what you are actually planning on, right? So that's kind of like the invitation that I make to everyone in terms of like considering this dimension.
All right, thanks so much. So that's some of the inside into the framework. You can read the paper for more from each of the co-authors on each of those topics. We've got like 10 minutes left. In thinking about like, I would invite you, we can have open discussion. We can have we can silently reflect, but I would invite you to try to make some connections between some of the dimensions that you reflected on in your social identity map and these dimensions of positionality as much as your understanding of them at this moment. If this is brand new to you, I have found I've done this with grad students, my grad students before, really brand new grad students, and I have found that just talking about just reflecting on research topic, or just like, your relationship to that issue of marginalization, or your relationship to engineering education, that can be an easier kind of opening window into the topic of positionality. And then, if you can keep going, thinking about epistemology and ontology are like much more the kind of next level after, you're familiar with some of those bigger words, researchy words. So yeah, I'll pretty much open up however we want to spend these last 10 minutes is fine with me. I'll just stop talking. You can reflectively write, but if anybody has comments into the chat or wants to unmute and share their thoughts, reflections on the whole topic, or reflections on one of these specific intersections, I'd really appreciate it. Okay.
Just as a quick reference,
Sorry,
we will take about a minute and a half at the end just to do the participant survey. And then you do have a question in the chat coming in.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, no problem, Ellie. So quickly before we go to questions, I did want to highlight what Matilda said about intentionality behind this and really connecting your identity. So this positionality statement, we're not here to tell you how to write one, and your positionality statement's probably not even going to look the same across studies that you're doing. As Matilda said, it's really connecting yourself to the research. So it moves beyond just listing your identities and putting that in a paper, but really integrating that even as an aspect of the research design in some instances. So as you reflect, think about that as well. It can be tough. It's a tough process, and it makes your brain hurt sometimes.
And not just that it is a tough process, but we're also situated in a space where there's no nurturing of an environment that allows for that to happen, right? Like, I've found it very difficult to, for example, start to bring in Chicano cultural studies methodologies, right, into areas like this type, the engineering education, because we are normed by a set guidelines of what rigorous research is supposed to look like a lot of the times.
I think we also have set guidelines in terms of like what the timeline for research should look like, and doing a really good positionality statement, it's not necessarily baked into our timeline, but also letting that intentionality be baked into the research design does add a little bit of time to the timeline for the project, and thinking about not just how do we write positionality statements for research that's already been done, but how do we bake in time into the grants that we have and the collaborations that we're doing to actually have space to have these conversations with our collaborators and have space to have these reflections with ourselves. Because I know for me, before we started doing this paper, it felt like a positionality statement was kind of like a cover letter that you just change a little bit every time. But in reality, it's something that should change pretty significantly every time based off of the way that your identity interacts with the research body, and that is complicated, does require time. And I think it requires researchers and people who are in academia to think a little bit more about how do we structure our workflow such that we have time to really reflect for real. And I think that's something we're seeing a little bit more of now, but it's not simple.
Yeah, I find it interesting that you bring it up as it is one of those things of like when, because agreeably until your workshop today, I thought your positionality could be kind of like a cover letter. And now I'm realizing that even the subcategories on the activity are going to matter in very different ways depending on the research that you do. And it brings in, subcategories. And now thinking about it, of when does my positionality matter? prior to the research, right? So not at the end when I'm disseminating, but at the beginning when I'm even approaching it.
Exactly. And I think that's a lot of, for me, the motivation in writing this paper was to bring it more front of mind. But also there exists, resources like the resource that Megan dropped in. Like there are ways for us to think about this and what this might mean for research design, what this might mean for collaborators, what this might even mean for, deciding what institution to go to as a scholar, right? And I think it's complicated, but I think the more that we are able to challenge ourselves and figure out ways to break that challenge, to bake that challenge into our processes, the better we'll get overall, right? And I think that's the goal. Not necessarily to get to a place where we have the perfect positionality statement, but to get to a place where we're all like doing research in the nitty gritty with our full selves as much as possible, right? And granted, like Alex mentioned, our structures don't have space for that just yet, but we're the people who get to make that space.
So we do have time for just any more questions from the audience or thoughts or input. There is a healthy chat going on around all of the domains in which this is relevant, and we could be reflecting on making it available to our own thoughts and others. Now, we don't actually have a survey from our CDI workshop team. I just want to make sure that our faculty, our presenters, our facilitators don't either.
Nope. This was how we were just ending with, that type of, those types of reflections. Yeah. No formal survey.
Wonderful. Well, I'll switch the screen really quick just to say once again that we would like you to join us for our next workshop as well, focusing in on one area of making engineering more accessible and inclusive of faculty with disabilities. And then Bree will probably drop in the link, hopefully, to that registration here. And as I turn the screen back to everyone else, I want to thank all of our presenters today. It was amazing to have you. I think we probably could equally spend another hour and a half with you in breakout rooms and with everybody. So I encourage you to continue to think about this. I believe we'll be seeing you again at ASWE as a team. I don't know how, yep, Megan's nodding her head for sure. Everybody's nodding their head. So there will be more opportunities to work with this team in workshops, and hope to see you all there. In the meantime, just heartfelt thank you to all of our presenters and all of our audience for being here.
Thank you so much. And I promise to do something slightly different at ASCE in person.